It began before dawn on January 22, 1944. Under a gray winter sky, the quiet beaches south of Rome trembled as landing craft from the Allied fleet surged toward the Italian coast. Operation Shingle, the bold plan to outflank German defenses and break the deadlock at Monte Cassino, was underway. The plan promised a swift march to Rome within days. But within a week, the men of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division would find themselves not advancing, but trapped. As the first waves landed near Anzio and Nettuno, there was little resistance. Soldiers from the U.S. 6th Corps, commanded by Major General John P. Lucas, were almost bewildered by the calm. It felt like a trick, wrote Private William Carter of the 15th Infantry Regiment. No shots, no movement, just the sound of the surf and our own breath. Within hours, Allied forces had seized the port of Anzio, unloading tanks, jeeps, and supplies in what looked like a flawless landing. Yet, the success was deceptive. Instead of pushing inland toward the Alban Hills, the key to cutting off German retreat routes, Lucas hesitated. Orders from higher command were cautious, emphasizing consolidation over risk. The pause gave Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, precious time to react. Within 48 hours, his countermeasures were already in motion. The German 14th Army, under General Eberhard von Mackensen, was redirected south toward the beachhead. Units from the elite Hermann Göring Panzer Division and 26th Panzer Division began assembling in the hills overlooking Anzio. The Allies, meanwhile, dug in literally. What was meant to be a staging point for a rapid offensive became a defensive cage, one surrounded by marshlands and overlooked ridges. Conditions on the ground worsened quickly. The winter rains turned fields into quagmires, making vehicle movement nearly impossible. Artillery duels began at dawn and ended only with darkness. The mud was like glue, and the shells came down like hammers, recalled Lieutenant James Melvin, a forward observer with the 3rd Infantry Division. We had nowhere to run, only holes to hide in. The Germans nicknamed the Allied pocket the Anzio Bowl, a perfect target for encirclement and bombardment. Strategically, the situation baffled even those at the top. Winston Churchill, frustrated by reports of stalemate, famously remarked, "I had hoped we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we got was a stranded whale." The delay at Anzio was not merely tactical, it was psychological. Soldiers sensed the shift in tone, from confidence to survival. Letters home grew darker, more uncertain. One entry from Medic's diary captured the mood. "We were supposed to march to Rome. Now we can barely crawl through mud without getting shelled." By early February, the German counterattack was in full swing. Operation Fishfang, launched on February 16th, unleashed a storm of armor and artillery aimed at crushing the beachhead once and for all. The 45th and 3rd Infantry Divisions bore the brunt, holding their lines around Carricito and Cisterna under ceaseless fire. Casualties mounted by the hundreds each day. The wounded filled every makeshift aid station, and field hospitals were forced to operate under bombardment. What made the situation worse was the mystery of missing patrols. Several small units sent out to reconnoiter the German lines never returned. Some were later found, executed, others simply vanished without a trace. Intelligence officers speculated that German infiltrators, disguised in captured uniforms, had slipped into Allied positions at night. A single misplaced radio signal could bring artillery fire down on friendly troops, and several such incidents were later documented in field reports. Whether these were errors or evidence of enemy deception remains debated by historians. By the 3rd week of February, morale was stretched thin. The men were exhausted, supply lines strained, and the dream of liberating Rome seemed distant. Still, the line held, thanks to relentless Allied naval gunfire and the sheer resilience of the troops. Yet, beneath the heroism, doubts grew about leadership and intelligence. Had the enemy known the landing site in advance? Why had the advance stalled when momentum was on their side? In hindsight, Anzio was a paradox, a perfect landing that led to near disaster. It showed how hesitation, even for a day, could turn victory into entrapment. For the men on the ground, however, there was no room for grand strategy, only survival. As night fell on February 18th, the rain eased, revealing the wreckage of tanks and trucks scattered across the flooded fields. Searchlights swept the horizon, illuminating the broken landscape. Somewhere beyond the ridge, German forces were regrouping for another assault. The Allies dug deeper into the mud, knowing dawn would bring more fire. The calm was temporary, and the worst was yet to come. Next, Chapter 2. The Disappearing Patrols of Anzio. By February 1944, the once promising Anzio beachhead had become a graveyard of stalled ambition. Allied troops were confined to a thin strip of land, a killing zone barely 7 miles deep, under the constant shadow of German artillery. Every movement was watched from the surrounding ridges. The men nicknamed the relentless barrage the Anzio Express, but the Germans had another name for it, Anzio Annie, the monstrous K-5 railway gun that fired 560-pound shells from miles away. Each detonation shook the ground like thunder, reminding soldiers that there was no safe place, even behind the lines. The monotony of waiting under fire bred a new kind of fear, the unknown. Patrols sent beyond the perimeter began disappearing without explanation. These reconnaissance teams, usually 6 to 10 men, slipped out under cover of darkness to map enemy movements near Campo Leone and Cisterna. Sometimes they returned with intelligence. Sometimes they didn't return at all. They just vanished, wrote Sergeant Robert Hill of the 7th Infantry Regiment. No sound, no signal, nothing. One night they're there. The next morning their foxholes are empty. At first, commanders believed the missing men had been captured. The Germans were known for efficient prisoner sweeps. But soon, reports emerged that some patrols never made radio contact after leaving. Not even the initial out signal. Intelligence officers feared the worst: infiltration. Rumors spread that German commandos from the Brandenburg Division, experts in disguise and deception, were operating behind Allied lines dressed in U.S. uniforms. In the confusion of the front, a friendly face could no longer be trusted. Life within the perimeter grew tense. Sentries double-checked passwords. Night movements were restricted. Even small acts, like lighting a cigarette, could draw suspicion or artillery fire. One chilling entry from an unknown soldier's journal reads, "We don't fear dying. We fear not being found." For those who manned the front, the mystery of the missing patrols became more haunting than the enemy shelling. Despite the tension, the 3rd Infantry Division and British 1st Division continued holding the line. Supplies trickled in through the battered Anzio port, where Navy engineers worked under bombardment to repair the docks. Field kitchens tried to maintain morale, serving lukewarm coffee and powdered eggs while shells whistled overhead. It's amazing what a warm drink can do when death's only a few hundred yards away, recalled Corporal Leonard Strauss of the 30th Infantry Regiment. The intelligence section of 6th Corps began compiling data on the disappearances. Maps were marked with the last known positions of lost units, small clusters of excess spreading across the map like dark constellations. One disturbing pattern emerged. Many of the vanished patrols have been operating near a section of abandoned farmhouses north of Cisterna. Air reconnaissance photos showed little movement, yet radio intercepts hinted that the Germans used the area for temporary command posts. It was decided that a special reconnaissance team from the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment would investigate. On the night of February 12, 1944, the team set out, 12 men, led by Lieutenant Arthur Mills. They carried Thompson submachine guns, compasses, and a single SCR 300 radio. They were expected back before dawn. The next morning, there was no contact. Search parties sent later that day found only fragments, boot prints fading into the mud, and a shredded map case near an irrigation ditch. No bodies, no equipment, no trace. The official report listed the patrol as MIA, presumed captured. But among those at Anzio, whispers began to spread that something deeper was at play, that the enemy might have known the patrol's route before they left. Whether through intercepted signals or a traitorous leak, the Germans seemed always one step ahead. As the weeks passed, each new loss deepened the sense of entrapment. The front became a maze of fear, suspicion, and exhaustion, a place where even survival felt uncertain. Colonel Darby, commanding officer of the Rangers, summed up the mood in a dispatch to headquarters: morale holding, confidence eroding. Men steady under fire, but haunted by what they cannot explain. The mystery of the disappearing patrols would soon tie into larger questions of compromised intelligence and deception, questions that would reach all the way to Allied command in London. As night fell once more over the drenched plains of Anzio, artillery thundered in the distance, lighting the sky with flashes of orange. Somewhere beyond that glow, men were still missing, and nobody knew why. Next, Chapter 3, The Leak in London. By mid-February 1944, the mystery at Anzio had begun to reach beyond the battlefield. In the dimly lit command tents near the shoreline, intelligence officers reviewed intercepted German transmissions that suggested the enemy knew details of Allied operations, routes, timings, even code names. The implications were chilling. Somewhere, information was leaking. The question was, from where? In London, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, liaison to British intelligence had been monitoring the same communications. A decrypted message from the German 14th Army hinted at foreknowledge of Allied reconnaissance missions, including one that matched the doomed 509th Parachute Patrol near Cisterna. The decrypt came through the Bletchley Park codebreakers, who were alarmed enough to flag it as urgent, potential compromise. That message would later disappear from official archives for nearly 30 years. The OSS station in London, under Colonel William Donovan's watch, coordinated with MI5 to review recent intelligence handovers between the Americans and British. Both sides had been running deception campaigns, fake radio chatter, phantom divisions, and false invasion routes to mislead German command. But somewhere in the overlap, truth and fiction had blurred. If genuine orders were mistakenly funneled through deception channels, it could explain the Germans' uncanny accuracy. A classified memo from February 1944, recently declassified in 1998, describes a tense meeting at the Allied Combined Chiefs of Staff Headquarters. British Brigadier Kenneth Strong, head of intelligence planning, reportedly stated, "If Kesselring is reading our book, someone's turned too many pages." His American counterpart, Colonel Thomas Parker, countered, "Or someone's selling them the script." The exchange highlighted a deeper issue, mistrust within the alliance itself. Back at Anzio, the consequences of that mistrust were deadly. Each failed patrol, each shelling of an unmarked position, eroded the troops' confidence that higher command knew what it was doing. "It felt like the enemy could see us before we saw them," wrote Private Harold Ames in a letter recovered from his effects after the war. "We'd change radio codes one day, and they'd jam us the next morning. Somebody had to be talking." In March, U.S. Signal Corps specialists were dispatched to Anzio to trace possible radio leaks. Their findings were disturbing. One transmitter, meant for encrypted field communication, had been broadcasting intermittently on an open frequency for over a week, likely due to operator error, but enough to give the enemy valuable data on troop movements. Whether that was the true cause of the German foresight, or merely one piece of a larger puzzle, remains uncertain. Meanwhile, a small MI5 detachment in London investigated suspected double agents within Italian exile circles who had access to Allied briefings. Some had previously worked with British intelligence during the North African campaign, but were now unaccounted for in Rome or Naples. One suspect, codenamed Falcon, reportedly vanished days before the Anzio landings. His file was marked status unknown. For modern historians, these fragments suggest a network of mistakes, a mixture of human error, overlapping deception operations, and perhaps deliberate betrayal. But at the time, all that mattered to the men at Anzio was survival. As reinforcements arrived and casualties mounted, the beachhead began to resemble a vast, static trench system, reminiscent of the First World War, not the mobile warfare the Allies had envisioned. The men joked grimly that every whisper carries a shell, reflecting the paranoia that had taken root among the ranks. Officers stopped discussing operations near radios, and even letters home were censored with unusual severity. Something had broken in the trust between soldier and command, and that fracture would soon have devastating consequences for the Ranger units preparing for the next offensive. In hindsight, the leak in London might never be fully proven. Too many records destroyed, too many names forgotten. Yet, the coincidences remain too precise to ignore. Someone, somewhere, had tipped the enemy off. As winter turned to early spring, the Allies at Anzio prepared for their most daring move yet, a breakout attempt that would test their courage, strategy, and faith in each other. Few could know that the operation, meant to restore initiative, would instead lead to one of the most tragic chapters of the Italian campaign. Next, Chapter 4. The Rangers' Last Stand at Cisterna. In the cold dawn of January 30th, 1944, the men of the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions crouched in silence near the edge of the Pontine Marshes, north of the Anzio beachhead. Their orders were clear: infiltrate German lines under cover of darkness, capture the town of Cisterna, and open the way for the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division to advance. It was the first major breakout attempt since the landing, and it would soon become one of the most disastrous small unit operations of the Italian campaign. The Rangers were elite, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, trained for speed and precision. But that night, they faced an enemy who was waiting. Unknown to the Allied command, German intelligence had intercepted operational chatter days earlier. Units from the 715th Infantry Division and elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division had reinforced Cisterna's defenses. Machine gun nests, mortars, and anti-tank guns ringed the approaches. The Germans even used straw and hay to conceal armored vehicles in barns and roadside ditches. As the Rangers moved out in silence at 0100 hours, the ground was thick with fog. They advanced single file through irrigation ditches and muddy fields. It was so quiet, you could hear your own heartbeat, wrote Sergeant Frank Davis in his diary. We thought we were ghosts. But near dawn, as they neared the town's outskirts, a flare burst overhead, followed by the deafening roar of German machine guns. The ambush was complete. Within minutes, the lead elements were pinned. Communication broke down as German armor rolled out of hidden positions. The Rangers, lightly armed with rifles and bazookas, were trapped. Attempts to radio back for artillery support failed. The SCR, 300 units either jammed or transmitted too weakly through the fog. Some reports suggest German operators had been mimicking Allied frequencies to intercept distress calls. Whether by deception or coincidence, the result was the same: silence. By 0800, the fields were a nightmare. The 3rd Ranger Battalion was surrounded. The 1st fought desperately to break through. They came out of the mist like shadows. Tanks, half-tracks, entire platoons, recalled Private Joseph Martins, one of the few survivors. We fired until our barrels burned. The fighting continued for hours, but by noon, it was over. Out of nearly 767 men, only 6 made it back to Allied lines. The rest were killed or captured. The aftermath was grim. German broadcasts soon reported the annihilation of the Ranger force at Cisterna. Field Marshal Kesselring himself reportedly visited the site, remarking on the courage of the Americans while privately noting how predictable their advance had been. Allied officers at Anzio were devastated. Colonel Darby, who had commanded the Rangers since their inception, was seen walking the perimeter in silence, his face gray with disbelief. Intelligence officers immediately began reviewing operational security protocols. How had the Germans known? Theories ranged from intercepted radio traffic to captured maps, but some suspected something darker: that the leak identified in London had reached the front through shared intelligence channels. A confidential OSS report later hinted that enemy counterintelligence showed unusual precision in forecasting Allied maneuvers within 48 hours of transmission. It was the same window between the planning of the Cisterna raid and its destruction. Strategically, the loss was catastrophic. The Ranger battalions, among the most experienced light infantry in the Allied arsenal, were effectively wiped out. The failure forced General Lucas to halt offensive operations for weeks, giving the Germans more time to entrench. "We lost more than men," one officer noted bitterly. "We lost our nerve." For the survivors, the psychological toll was immense. Letters written from the beachhead after Cisterna spoke of ghosts in the trenches, not in a supernatural sense, but as a description of morale. The men moved like phantoms, going through the motions of defense, haunted by memories of those left behind. The fields around Cisterna remained in no man's land for months, littered with wreckage and the unburied dead. In London and Washington, the news of the Ranger disaster was censored from public release. Official communiques described heavy fighting and tactical adjustments, omitting the scale of the loss. It would take decades before the full details became public. Even today, some wartime reports remain classified, marked with cryptic phrases like sensitive sources and ongoing intelligence relevance. The lesson of Cisterna was harsh and enduring. Even the best-trained soldiers could fall victim to poor coordination, overconfidence, and compromised intelligence. As Churchill would later write, in war, the line between boldness and folly is often drawn by a whisper or the lack of one. The surviving Rangers were reassigned or absorbed into other units. Their camp, once a hive of activity, stood empty. And though the guns at Anzio still thundered daily, something vital had been lost on that blood-soaked morning. The illusion that courage alone could overcome the enemy's unseen advantage. Next, Chapter 5, Secrets in the Archives. For decades after the war, the Anzio campaign remained a story of courage overshadowed by confusion. Official histories emphasize the eventual Allied victory, the breakout, and the liberation of Rome. But in the archives, among the sealed folders and redacted cables, another story lay buried. It was a tale of misdirection, deception, and errors so intertwined that uncovering the truth seemed almost impossible. In the late 1970s, a new wave of historians gained access to declassified British and American documents under the Freedom of Information Act. Among them was a researcher named Dr. Charles Whitman from the University of Cambridge. Whitman stumbled upon a series of memoranda labeled Anzio Intelligence Coordination, Restricted. Inside were references to dual-channel communications between MI5 and the OSS. These documents revealed that both agencies had run simultaneous operations using overlapping code names and, at times, the same courier systems. The purpose was to deceive German intelligence through fake broadcasts and reports. But the risk was obvious. If any of the genuine information was mixed with fabricated data, it could easily be intercepted and mistaken for truth. One OSS file noted, "Some agents are reporting under false designations to maintain cover, making identification of authentic transmissions difficult." That line alone explained how confusion might have filtered up the chain of command and possibly into enemy hands. Adding to the mystery, newly declassified signals from Bletchley Park showed that German radio operators often mirrored Allied deception frequencies almost perfectly. It wasn't clear whether they had broken the encryption or were simply mimicking Allied radio patterns. But the effect was devastating. The ghost signals caused Allied intelligence officers to mistrust their own communications. "We were fighting in the dark," one post-war debrief recorded, with echoes bouncing off every wall. Even more shocking was a memo marked "Eyes Only," dated February 14, 1944, the day after the 509th Parachute Patrol vanished. The document mentioned a potential compromise of the Anzio field cipher and recommended immediate rotation of codebooks. However, this change did not occur until February 20th, 6 days too late. During that gap, every message from 6 Corps could have been intercepted. The evidence suggested that by the time of the Rangers' attack at Cisterna, German commanders might have known exactly when and where it would occur. Historians like Anthony Beaver and Rick Atkinson would later connect these dots to a broader issue: the overload of intelligence operations in the Mediterranean theater. Between MI5, MI6, the OSS, and local Italian resistance networks, coordination had become chaotic. Everyone had pieces of the puzzle, but no one held the full picture. "Too many secrets in one war," Beaver wrote, "and too few people able to tell which ones mattered." Dr. Whitman's findings reignited interest in the Anzio mystery. In interviews, he described visiting the U.S. National Archives and finding pages literally torn from reports dated March 1944. "There were gaps you could drive a truck through," he said. "You could see where history had been edited in real time." He believed the missing records weren't evidence of conspiracy, but of embarrassment, that the Allies had realized, too late, how dangerously overcomplicated their intelligence web had become. The implications reached beyond Anzio. Lessons from that failure later shaped NATO intelligence protocols during the Cold War, emphasizing strict separation of real and deceptive information channels. As one retired intelligence officer put it, "We learned at Anzio that when everyone's in charge of secrecy, no one is." Yet, For those who had fought there, these revelations came decades too late. Veterans who had lived through the shelling and seen their comrades vanish could only wonder how many lives were lost to miscommunication rather than enemy fire. The truth, wrote one surviving ranger in a 1982 letter, wasn't buried in the mud of Italy. It was buried in filing cabinets. By the end of the 20th century, most official records of the Anzio operation had been released. But the gaps, the missing pages, the censored names, the unaccounted patrols, still left shadows on the story. The battlefield may have been mapped, but the truth remained partly hidden, locked in a fog of war that never fully cleared. Next, Chapter 6. The Silence of Nate Tuno. By June 1944, the guns at Anzio had fallen silent. The breakout, long delayed, finally came with Operation Buffalo, a coordinated Allied assault that drove through the weakened German lines and opened the road to Rome. On June 4th, American armored columns rolled triumphantly into the Eternal City. To the world, it was a victory. But for those who had endured the siege, the taste was hollow. The cost had been staggering. More than 43,000 Allied casualties, thousands missing, and an unspoken sense that the victory had come far too late. The beaches that had once echoed with shellfire were now eerily quiet. The air still smelled faintly of cordite and seawater. Scattered across the plains between Anzio and Nate Tuno lay the wreckage of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, twisted remnants of a battle that had lasted 136 brutal days. U.S. Army engineers worked to clear mines and fill the massive craters left by German railway guns. Beneath the soil, however, another story was buried: the fate of the men who had vanished during the siege. As recovery teams combed the countryside, they found scattered traces of the missing patrols: a dog tag half buried in the mud near Carrecedo, a rusted carbine discovered in a collapsed farmhouse, and a diary sealed in a waterproof pouch. The last entry, written in faint pencil, simply read, "We hold until dawn." Of the 509th Parachute Patrol that disappeared in February, not one body was ever officially identified. Their names remain etched on the tablets of the missing at the Sicily, Rome American Cemetery in Nate Tuno. The mystery of their disappearance would never be conclusively solved. Some historians argue they were ambushed and buried in unmarked graves. Others believe they were captured and executed by German forces retreating north. A handful of veterans even claim to have heard intercepted transmissions referencing American ghosts operating near the Pontine marshes long after the lines had moved on. None of these accounts could be verified, but they added to the enduring legend of the lost patrols of Anzio. In later years, the quiet town of Nate Tuno became a place of reflection rather than warfare. Rows upon rows of white marble crosses stretch toward the horizon, each one marking a life cut short in the mud of the Italian campaign. Visitors often pause at the section reserved for the missing, men with no known graves, their sacrifice remembered only in name. They fought in silence, reads an inscription near the entrance, and their silence endures. For historians, the Anzio campaign stands as both a lesson and a warning. It demonstrated the courage of ordinary soldiers caught in extraordinary circumstances, and the deadly consequences of intelligence failures in modern warfare. The battle exposed the limits of technology, the fragility of communication, and the human cost of decisions made far from the front. In the end, wrote a British war correspondent, Anzio was not a defeat of arms, but of understanding. Today, the beaches where the invasion began are peaceful. Children play where landing craft once grounded in fire. Locals walk along the shoreline, unaware that beneath the sand lie fragments of helmets, buttons, and shell casings, silent relics of a forgotten siege. Time has washed away the sound of artillery, but not the questions. Why were the patrols left unaccounted for? How much did Allied command truly know about the leaks that doomed their men? The answers may never come. What remains is the echo of courage. Men who fought and died believing their struggle mattered, even when history nearly forgot them. As the sun sets over the Tyrrhenian Sea, the wind carries faint whispers across the fields of Nate Tuno, where the fallen rest in perfect rows. It is said that on quiet evenings, one can almost hear the surf breaking against the shore, just as it did in January 1944, when the first wave of soldiers landed, full of hope, unaware that their mission would become one of the most haunting stories of the Second World War. 6 chapters finished, waiting for prompt 3.